The champagne glass trembled in my hand. I shouldn't have been holding it at all. Widows in half-mourning weren't supposed to drink at weddings, weren't supposed to smile, weren't supposed to exist in spaces filled with white silk and promises of forever. But here I was, Charlotte Ashford, standing at the edge of my cousin's garden reception, watching brides I'd never meet spin in their new husband's arms. The charcoal gown clung to me like a second skin, marking me as clearly as if I'd worn a sign, damaged, used, discarded. "She shouldn't have come," a voice drifted over the music, sharp with judgment. 6 months is hardly enough time, and with Thomas's debts still unpaid. My spine straightened. Let them whisper, let them stare. I'd stopped caring what society thought the day Thomas's creditors started knocking on my door, the day his family looked straight through me as if I'd never been his wife at all. 6 months. 6 months since Thomas had fallen from his horse, the polite fiction everyone pretended to believe. 6 months since I'd discovered the gambling debts, the drinking, the lies stacked so high they'd crushed him before the fall ever could. And somehow, that made me a ghost at my own family's wedding. Not quite grieving enough to be sympathetic, not quite recovered enough to be welcomed. The receiving line stretched before me like a trial. I'd already seen my aunt glance away, already felt the cold courtesy of cousins who once called me dear. Thomas's family had made their position devastatingly clear. His debts were not their concern, and neither was his widow. I was 26 years old, and entirely, catastrophically alone. "Miss Hartley," the voice came from beside me, low and commanding, cutting through the string quartet like a knife through silk. Someone had demoted me from Mrs. Ashford back to my maiden name, as if my marriage had been erased along with my husband's life. I turned. The Duke of Thornbridge stood at my elbow, his presence somehow both startling and inevitable. I'd seen him from across ballrooms before. Who hadn't? He was the kind of man who seemed carved from authority itself. Dark hair swept back from a face too severe to be handsome in the conventional sense, but impossible to look away from. Eyes the color of smoke. "Your Grace," I managed, dropping into a curtsy that felt absurdly formal given that we'd never been introduced. "Walk with me." It wasn't a question. My breath caught. I'm not." His hand was already at my elbow, guiding me away from the receiving line with the casual certainty of someone who'd never been told no. "Before Richard Ashford reaches you." I glanced back. My late husband's cousin was cutting through the crowd, his expression carrying that particular blend of false concern and predatory satisfaction that had become sickeningly familiar. He'd been making increasingly aggressive noises about the house I still occupied, Thomas's house, which apparently Richard felt entitled to, along with everything else my husband had left behind. The Duke's grip tightened almost imperceptibly, steering me toward the edge of the garden where rose trellises created pockets of privacy. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was improper. This was, "How much do you owe?" I stopped walking. The directness of the question stole my breath. "I beg your pardon?" "Your late husband's debt. How much?" Heat flooded my cheeks. "That is none of your £3,000, he said with the certainty of someone who already knew. "Give or take." I couldn't breathe. How did he know? How could he possibly? And Richard Ashford has been circling like a vulture, hasn't he? Offering to settle matters. If you'll just sign over the house and disappear quietly to some cottage in the country where society won't have to look at you anymore. The accuracy of it made me dizzy. "Your Grace, I don't understand why you..." "Because I need something from you." His eyes met mine, and there was something almost desperate beneath that commanding exterior. Something that made me forget propriety, forget scandal, forget everything except the raw honesty in his gaze. "And you need protection, so we're going to help each other." The world seemed to tilt. Around us, the wedding continued, laughter and music, and the gentle clink of crystal. But in this small pocket of garden, with rose-scented air heavy between us, I felt like I was standing at the edge of a precipice. I started, but he cut me off. "Pretend you're my bride." The words hung in the air like something impossible, like a door opening onto a room I'd never imagined entering. Before you find out what happened next, if you love stories of impossible choices, and unexpected chances, stories that make you believe in love when you've lost all hope, hit that subscribe button now. Because what the Duke proposed that day would change everything I thought I knew about duty, deception, and the dangerous territory between protection and passion. "Have you lost your mind?" I heard myself ask, though my voice sounded distant, disconnected. "Not yet." His mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Though my mother's matchmaking efforts are bringing me close. She's invited 7 eligible ladies to my estate for the summer. 7 women who see me as nothing more than a title and a fortune. I need them gone, and I need society to stop treating me like a prize bull at auction." "You want me to pretend to be engaged to you?" The words felt absurd even as I spoke them. "Yes, that's insane. That's practical." He glanced back toward the wedding party. Richard Ashford was still searching for me, his expression darkening as he scanned the crowd. "You need money and protection from creditors. I need freedom from fortune hunters and my mother's schemes. We announce an engagement tonight. You come to Thornbridge Manor for the summer as my intended. At the end of the season, we part amicably, citing mutual unsuitability. You keep a generous settlement that will clear your debts and secure your independence. I keep my peace." It was insane. It was also the first offer of help anyone had made since Thomas died, really died. Not the careful fiction everyone pretended about his fall from his horse. The fall that had come after months of gambling and drinking, after the creditors had started circling, after he'd stopped looking me in the eye. Why me? The question escaped before I could stop it. The Duke's expression shifted, became something raw and unguarded. "Because you're the only woman in this garden who looks like she'd rather be anywhere else. Because you won't actually want to marry me at the end, which makes you the safest choice I could possibly make. And because," he paused, and something flickered in those smoke-gray eyes. "Because you looked at me just now like I might be a real person instead of a title and a fortune." Something in my chest cracked open. This powerful, unreachable man looked almost lonely. "If I say yes," I said slowly, my mind racing through implications and impossibilities, "what exactly would this arrangement entail?" The Duke's shoulders relaxed infinitesimally, as if my question itself was a kind of agreement. "Public appearances, enough affection to be believable. You'd have your own rooms at Thornbridge, your own freedom. All I ask is that you help me discourage my mother's matchmaking efforts and look convincingly devoted when society is watching. And at the end of summer, we part as friends. You get £20,000 and a story about mutual unsuitability that preserves both our reputations. I get my mother off my back for at least another year. £20,000. The number echoed in my mind like a bell. It was more than I'd earn in a lifetime of teaching or sewing or any other respectable poverty I'd been contemplating. It was freedom. It was also a lie. I looked at the Duke, really looked at him. At the tension in his jaw, the exhaustion around his eyes, the way he stood as if carrying weight that had nothing to do with his expensive coat and polished boots. Whatever drove him to this desperate proposal, it was real. And somehow that mattered. "One condition," I heard myself say. His eyebrows rose. "You're negotiating? When we part, you tell the truth that I wasn't suitable, that I'm too marked by grief and debt to be a proper duchess. I won't have you shouldering the blame for ending things." Something flickered in his expression. Respect, perhaps. "You'd rather be seen as damaged than let me be seen as fickle." "I'm already seen as damaged, Your Grace. You have a reputation to maintain. I have nothing left to lose." It was the wrong thing to say. I saw it in how his expression tightened, how his hand at my elbow became almost protective. "Then we agree on one thing," he said quietly. "You have nothing left to lose, so take the risk, Miss Hartley. Let me help you." I thought of Richard Ashford and his vulture smile, of the landlord's letters piling up on my desk, each one more threatening than the last, of the way people looked through me now instead of at me, as if widowhood had rendered me transparent. "Yes," I whispered. The Duke's shoulders dropped almost imperceptibly, as if he'd been holding his breath. "Then let me do this properly." He raised his voice just enough to carry, and suddenly I realized we'd gathered an audience. Half the wedding party had drifted close enough to eavesdrop, their interest barely concealed behind fans and champagne glasses. "Miss Hartley," the Duke said, his voice resonating with authority and something else, something that almost sounded tender. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The garden went silent. Even the string quartet seemed to pause mid-note. I felt the weight of every eye, every judgment, every assumption. This was it, the moment that would define everything that came after. I could refuse, walk away, return to my cramped rented rooms and mounting debts. Or I could step into this beautiful, terrifying lie. "Yes," I said clearly, "I will." The Duke smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached his eyes and transformed his severe face into something almost devastating. "Thank you," he murmured, low enough that only I could hear. Then louder, "You've made me very happy." He raised my gloved hand to his lips. The kiss was perfectly proper, barely a brush of his mouth against silk, but I felt it like a brand, like a promise of something neither of us had agreed to. The garden erupted into carefully modulated chaos. Congratulations mixed with shock, mixed with poorly hidden malice. I saw Richard Ashford's face go white with rage. Saw the bride's mother calculating social implications with visible arithmetic in her expression. Saw 7 beautifully dressed young ladies deflate with identical disappointment. And then I saw her, the Duke's mother, the Dowager Duchess of Thornbridge, sweeping toward us like a force of nature. She was tall, elegant, formidable, with her son's same smoke-gray eyes, but none of his warmth. "Adrian," she said coolly, "how unexpected." "Mother," the Duke's voice carried a warning, "allow me to introduce my fiancée, Miss Charlotte Hartley." The Dowager's gaze cut to me, sharp and assessing. I felt myself being evaluated, measured, and found catastrophically wanting in the space of 3 seconds. "I see." Her tone could have frozen champagne. "How long have you been acquainted?" "Long enough to know my own heart." The Duke's response was smooth, practiced. "I trust you'll welcome Charlotte to the family." It wasn't a question. It was a command wrapped in courtesy. The Dowager's mouth thinned to a bloodless line. "Of course. How could I do otherwise?" She turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "My dear, you must be overwhelmed. We'll have so much to discuss once we return to Thornbridge." It was a threat disguised as welcome, and everyone knew it. "I look forward to it, Your Grace," I managed. "Don't," the Duke muttered as his mother swept away, already gathering allies and gossips in her wake. "Don't look forward to any of it." I watched the Dowager disappear into the crowd, leaving whispers and speculation like breadcrumbs behind her. "I think I've just made a powerful enemy." "You've just become my fiancé." "You've made 7 powerful enemies, every woman my mother invited to Thornbridge this summer." He offered his arm. "But you've also gained a rather useful ally. Shall we face the wolves together, Miss Hartley?" I slid my hand into the crook of his elbow. The wool of his jacket was fine beneath my gloves, expensive and perfectly tailored. Everything about him screamed old money, ancient title, the kind of power I'd never been close to. "Together," I agreed, even though I wasn't sure what I'd just committed to. As we walked back toward the wedding party, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a garden mirror. I looked different, not happier exactly, but present, visible, like I'd somehow become real again after months of being a ghost. "We leave for Thornbridge in 3 days, the Duke said quietly. "Pack light. You'll have new wardrobes made once we arrive. Anything you need, tell my secretary." "Your Grace." "Adrian," he corrected, even more quietly. "If we're to be convincingly engaged, you should probably use my name." Using his Christian name felt impossibly intimate, more intimate than the fake engagement somehow. "Adrian," I managed. The name felt strange in my mouth, like trying on clothes that didn't quite fit. "What happens if we fail? If no one believes us?" He looked at me, then really looked at me, and I felt pinned by that smoke-gray gaze. "Then we'll fail together. But I don't intend to fail, Charlotte. And neither, I suspect, do you." He was right. I'd already lost everything once. I wasn't going to lose again. Even if the price of winning was pretending to love a duke I barely knew. The carriage to Thornbridge Manor was more luxurious than anything I'd ever experienced. Velvet seats the color of wine, brass fixtures polished to a mirror gleam, windows large enough to watch the countryside unfold like a painting come to life. I sat across from Adrian. I had to remember to think of him by his Christian name now, and tried not to feel like an imposter wearing someone else's skin. 3 days had passed since the wedding. 3 days of hasty preparations, shocked callers leaving cards I couldn't afford to return, and Richard Ashford's barely contained fury. He'd shown up at my boarding house the morning after the engagement announcement, all false concern and thinly veiled threats. "You're making a mistake," he'd said, blocking my doorway with the confidence of a man who'd never been denied anything. "The Duke is using you. Everyone knows it. A widow with nothing when he could have anyone." I looked him straight in the eye and smiled. Perhaps he prefers someone who wants him for himself, not his money. It had been a lie, but a satisfying one. Richard had left, but not before promising that this humiliation, my elevation, he'd meant would be temporary. Now I was alone with my fake fiancé, rolling through the English countryside toward a house I'd only heard about in gossip and scandal sheets. Thornbridge Manor, seat of the Duchy of Thornbridge for 300 years. A place so grand that even its gatehouse was larger than the home I'd shared with Thomas. "You're nervous," Adrian observed. I glanced at him. He'd been reading correspondence for most of the journey, dealing with what seemed like an endless stream of estate business. Now his attention was entirely on me, and it was more unnerving than his distraction had been. "Would you believe me if I said no?" "Not remotely." His mouth curved slightly. "It's a reasonable reaction. You're about to walk into a house full of people who will despise you on sight. How encouraging." "I prefer honesty to comfort." He set aside his letters, giving me his full attention. "My mother has already arrived with her 7 candidates for Duchess. They were supposed to have a month of my undivided attention. Now they're attending a house party where they'll watch me be devoted to someone else. They will not be kind." My stomach tightened. "Perhaps you should tell me about them. Know your enemy and all that." Adrian's expression shifted to something almost amused. "Practical. I like that." He leaned back against the velvet seat, and for a moment, he looked less like a duke and more like a man preparing for battle. "Lady Beatrice Ashford, no relation to your late husband's family, is beautiful, accomplished, and utterly convinced that being a duchess is her birthright. She'll attack your dignity." Noted. "Lady Cordelia Winters is quieter, but perhaps more dangerous. She'll befriend you, learn your weaknesses, then use them against you when it serves her purpose." I absorbed this, my mind cataloging threats like a general planning defense. "And the others?" "Miss Eleanor Hartwick is young and romantic. She'll cry, loudly, frequently. It's surprisingly effective as a weapon." He paused, and something darker crossed his face. "Miss Sarah Preston is brilliant with numbers, and will likely try to prove you're after my money. Lady Victoria Somerset has political connections that could make your life miserable if she chooses." "Miss Jane Hartley." "Hartley?" I interrupted. "Like me?" "Distant relation, apparently." My mother thought it would be charming. His expression suggested he found nothing charming about it. "Jane will probably use that connection to claim your social climbing through family shame. And finally, Miss Catherine Blackwood is..." He trailed off, and I watched something complicated move across his face. "She's what?" I pressed. "She's the one my mother actually wants me to marry." His voice had gone flat, carefully empty. "Impeccable breeding, substantial dowry, connections to half the peerage. She's also intelligent, kind, and entirely unsuited to being married to someone like me." There was a story there, layers of meaning I couldn't quite decipher. "You sound almost regretful." "I'm regretful that she's been dragged into my mother's schemes. Catherine deserves better than to be used as a pawn." He met my eyes. "Which is why we need to be convincing enough that she feels free to refuse me without social consequences." For the first time, I glimpsed the complexity beneath this arrangement. Adrian wasn't just protecting himself, he was trying to protect these women from a fate they didn't want, even as they competed for it. "You're not what I expected," I said softly. "What did you expect?" "Someone more selfish, someone who saw people as tools." "Give it time," he said, but there was no humor in it. "You may change your mind." Before I could respond, the carriage slowed. Through the window, I caught my first glimpse of Thornbridge Manor, and the sight stole whatever words I might have found. The house rose from manicured grounds like something from a dream or a nightmare, depending on one's perspective. Golden stone glowed in the afternoon light, dozens of windows reflecting the sky like watchful eyes. Wings stretched east and west from a central structure crowned with more chimneys than I could count. Gardens sprawled in geometric precision, and beyond them, parkland rolled toward distant woods. "Dear God," I breathed. "Intimidating, isn't it?" Adrian's voice held a note of something almost like apology. "My great-great-grandfather had delusions of grandeur. Every generation since has been paying for his ambition." The carriage rolled to a stop before the main entrance, where a line of servants stood at attention. My throat went dry. I'd been a gentleman's wife, yes, but Thomas's household had consisted of 3 servants and a cook. This looked like an army. "Charlotte." Adrian's hand covered mine briefly, startlingly warm even through our gloves. "Remember, you're here as my choice. That gives you power, whether you feel it or not. My mother may be formidable, but she cannot unmake what I've announced publicly. What if I embarrass you?" The fear escaped before I could stop it. "What if I use the wrong fork or address someone incorrectly? Or, then you'll be human." His gaze held mine with unexpected intensity. "These women my mother invited, they've been trained since birth to be perfect duchesses. But perfection is exhausting to watch and impossible to love. Just be yourself." A footman opened the carriage door, and there was no more time for doubt. Adrian descended first, then turned to help me down. As my feet touched the gravel drive, I heard the whispers start. Servants weren't supposed to gossip where they could be heard, but shock apparently overrode training. "That's her? She's older than I expected. Not even particularly pretty, is she?" I lifted my chin and took Adrian's offered arm. Let them whisper. Let them judge. I'd survived worse than servants' gossip. The Dowager Duchess waited in the entrance hall, a space so vast my voice would probably echo if I dared to speak. She stood like a queen on a battlefield, with 7 young women arrayed behind her like an honor guard. Each one was more beautiful than the last, dressed in the height of fashion, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. "Adrian," the Dowager said, her voice carrying the chill of a January frost. "Welcome home." And Miss Hartley. She invested my name with enough disdain to make it sound like an insult. "How unexpected to see you here." "Mother." Adrian's tone held a warning. "Charlotte will be staying in the Rose Suite. Please ensure she has everything she needs." "The Rose Suite?" One of the women behind the Dowager Lady Beatrice, I guessed from her classical beauty and imperious bearing, stepped forward. "But that's the suite reserved for the future Duchess." "Exactly," Adrian said smoothly, "which makes it perfect for my fiancé." The word hung in the air like a declaration of war. I watched 7 beautiful faces transform shock, anger, calculation, and in one case, what looked almost like relief. The Dowager's expression could have frozen fire. "Of course, how thoughtful of you to make arrangements without consulting me, as always." She turned to the women behind her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ladies, may I present Miss Charlotte Hartley, my son's fiancée. Charlotte, this is Lady Beatrice Ashford, Lady Cordelia Winters, Miss Eleanor Hartwick, Miss Sarah Preston, Lady Victoria Somerset, Miss Jane Hartley, and Miss Catherine Blackwood." I managed curtsies to each in turn, trying to match names to faces, while 7 pairs of eyes evaluated every aspect of my person. My dress, bought ready-made and hastily altered, suddenly felt shabby next to their silk and lace. My hair, dressed by my own hands, probably looked provincial next to their elaborate coiffures. "Miss Hartley." It was Catherine Blackwood who spoke first, stepping forward with a genuine smile that made her lovely face absolutely radiant. "What a pleasure to meet you. Adrian has been so mysterious about your courtship, you must tell us everything. How did you meet?" The question was perfectly polite, perfectly innocent, and perfectly designed to expose our lie. Because, of course, we had no story. We'd barely spoken before 3 days ago. I felt Adrian tense beside me, but before either of us could answer, another voice cut through the hall. "Yes, do tell." Lady Beatrice's smile was a blade wrapped in velvet. "We're all desperately curious how a widow from—" She paused delicately. "Where are you from, Miss Hartley?" "I don't believe I've heard your family name in society." "My family is from Hertfordshire," I said, keeping my voice steady. "And I met Adrian at my cousin's wedding." "How romantic," Eleanor Hartwick breathed, her eyes already filling with tears. "A wedding, like fate itself was blessing your union." "More like convenience," Jane Hartley said coolly. Our shared surname clearly gave her no sense of kinship. "I imagine Adrian needed a partner for the reception line, and you were available." The word carried implications that made my cheeks burn, but Adrian's hand tightened on my arm. "Actually," he said, his voice dropping to something dangerously soft, "I took one look at Charlotte and knew I'd found someone extraordinary, someone real, someone who didn't see me as a title to be won or a fortune to be captured." His gaze swept across the assembled women. It was quite refreshing. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the weight of 7 women's hatred settling onto my shoulders like a physical thing. The Dowager broke the silence with a clap of her hands. "Well, this has been illuminating. Ladies, shall we adjourn to the drawing room for tea? I'm sure Miss Hartley would like to rest after her journey." The dismissal was clear. "Actually," Adrian said, "I thought I'd show Charlotte the grounds. We've much to discuss." "I'm sure you do." The Dowager's smile was a warning. "Do try to return before dinner. We dress formally at Thornbridge." As we walked away, I could feel their eyes burning into my back. 7 women who wanted what I was pretending to have. 1 dowager who would stop at nothing to unmake me. "That went well," I murmured once we were out of earshot. "That was a disaster," Adrian corrected, "and it's going to get worse before it gets better. My mother doesn't lose gracefully, Charlotte. Neither does Lady Beatrice. And you've just painted a target on your back that won't disappear until this charade ends." I looked up at him, at the worry I hadn't expected to see in his eyes. "Are you having second thoughts?" "Every moment since I asked you to do this." He stopped walking, turned to face me fully. "But I'm also more certain than I've been about anything in years. Because watching you stand there, facing them down without flinching, Charlotte, you're stronger than any of them. Stronger than me, perhaps." "I'm terrified," I admitted. "Good," he said. "So am I. Fear means we understand what we're facing, and we're facing it together. Remember? Together." The word felt impossibly fragile and surprisingly solid all at once. As we walked through Thornbridge's gardens, I tried not to think about the 7 enemies I'd just made, or the Dowager's cold calculation, or the fact that I was living a lie that felt more dangerous with every passing moment. But I couldn't quite shake the feeling that the most dangerous thing of all was how Adrian's hand on my arm felt less like performance and more like protection, and how much I was beginning to want that to be real. Dinner at Thornbridge Manor was orchestrated warfare disguised as civility. I'd been dressed by a maid who appeared in my room an hour before the meal, carrying gowns I hadn't packed, silks and satins in deep jewel tones that must have cost more than I'd spent on clothing in my entire life. The emerald green she'd selected made my skin look porcelain, my dark hair lustrous against the rich fabric. I barely recognized the woman staring back at me from the mirror. "His Grace has excellent taste," the maid murmured as she fastened a necklace of diamonds around my throat. Diamonds. Real ones. These were his grandmother's. "He insisted you wear them tonight." My fingers touched the stones, cold and heavy against my skin. This was armor, I realized. Adrian was dressing me for battle. The dining room stretched longer than my entire boarding house, lit by 3 massive chandeliers that turned the space into something from a fairy tale or a nightmare. 20 places had been set, though only 11 would be filled, the Dowager at one end, Adrian at the other, and the 7 candidates arrayed along the sides like opposing armies. I'd been placed at Adrian's right hand, the position of honor that made my status unmistakable. I was the last to arrive. Every face turned as I entered, and I watched the calculation happen in real time. Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed at the diamonds. Sarah Preston's gaze catalogued the cost of my gown with visible mathematics. Even Catherine Blackwood looked momentarily disconcerted, though she recovered with a gracious smile. Adrian stood, his expression unreadable, and pulled out my chair himself rather than letting a servant do it. "You look beautiful," he said, and it sounded almost real. "Your grandmother's diamonds suit Miss Hartley remarkably well," the dowager observed from the far end of the table. "Though I'm surprised you remembered where they were kept. You haven't asked after them in years." "Some things are worth remembering when the occasion demands it," Adrian replied smoothly, taking his seat. "Shall we begin?" The first course arrived, a delicate soup that smelled of mushrooms and cream. I picked up what I hoped was the correct spoon, hyper-aware of 7 women watching my every movement. "Tell me, Miss Hartley," Lady Victoria Somerset began, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone born into political power. "What are your thoughts on the reform bill currently before Parliament? Surely, as the future Duchess of Thornbridge, you have opinions on such matters." The trap was obvious. If I claimed knowledge, I'd be tested. If I admitted ignorance, I'd be dismissed as unfit. "I think," I said carefully, "that any woman who claims to fully understand politics as it's currently practiced would be lying. We're not permitted to participate, after all. Though I suspect we'd make rather less of a mess of things if we were." Eleanor Hartwick gasped. Sarah Preston's eyebrows rose, but Adrian's mouth curved into something that might have been approval. "How radical," Lady Beatrice said, her tone suggesting I'd just confessed to treason. "I'm sure that perspective will serve you well in society, should you actually become Duchess, of course." "Beatrice," Catherine said quietly, but there was steel beneath the gentleness. "That's unkind." "Is it?" Beatrice turned her perfect smile on me. "I'm simply curious about Miss Hartley's suitability. After all, the Duchess of Thornbridge has responsibilities beyond wearing diamonds. Charitable committees, social obligations, managing one of the largest estates in England. It would be rather tragic if she were overwhelmed." "Charlotte won't be overwhelmed," Adrian said, his voice cold enough to frost the soup bowls. "She's already managed far more difficult circumstances than anything Thornbridge could present." "You mean her late husband's debts?" Jane Hartley asked, false innocence dripping from every word. "Yes, I heard about that unfortunate situation. £3,000, wasn't it? Such a burdensome inheritance." The room went silent. Even the servants froze in the act of serving. My face burned. But I forced myself to meet Jane's eyes. Yes, Thomas left debts. He also left lessons about the difference between wealth and character. I'm grateful for both. "How philosophical," Jane murmured. "Though I wonder, did Adrian know about your financial difficulties before he proposed or after?" The implication was clear. I was a fortune hunter, no different from them except more desperate. "I knew everything," Adrian said, his tone leaving no room for argument, including the fact that Charlotte had the courage to face her circumstances with dignity, rather than hiding behind family connections or social pretense. "Perhaps that's why I found her so refreshingly different from," he paused meaningfully, "other women I've encountered." Lady Cordelia Winters, who'd been silent until now, set down her spoon with deliberate care. "Different is certainly one word for it, though I confess, I'm curious about your courtship. 3 days from meeting to engagement seems rather hasty, almost as if there wasn't time for proper consideration." "Love doesn't follow timetables," Eleanor breathed, her romantic soul apparently willing to defend even a rival. "Sometimes you just know. Sometimes you just calculate," Sarah Preston corrected, her sharp mind clearly working through numbers I didn't want calculated. "Tell me, Miss Hartley, when exactly did you and Adrian meet? Before or after your creditors began threatening eviction?" My hands clenched in my lap, nails biting into palms. This was worse than I'd imagined. They weren't just questioning my suitability, they were dismantling my entire life, exposing every vulnerability, every shame. "That's enough." Adrian's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Charlotte's finances are none of your concern. Neither is the timeline of our courtship. What should concern you is that I've made my choice, and that choice is final. Is it? The dowager spoke for the first time since the meal began, her words dropping into the tension like stones into still water. Because final choices should be made with clear heads, not clouded by, she paused delicately, temporary infatuations. Perhaps Miss Hartley might benefit from understanding exactly what she's agreeing to. The responsibilities, the scrutiny, the expectations. Mother, no, Adrian. If Miss Hartley is to be Duchess, she should see what that means. The dowager's smile was poisonous honey. Tomorrow, Charlotte, you'll accompany me on my rounds. The tenants, the village, the various committees I manage. Let's see how you handle the reality of this position. It was a test, one designed for me to fail publicly and spectacularly. I'd be honored, I said, though my mouth felt full of ashes. The dowager's eyes glittered with anticipated victory. Excellent. We'll begin at dawn. I hope you're an early riser. The rest of dinner passed in calculated pleasantries and subtle cruelties. By the time dessert arrived, something elaborate involving sugarwork and raspberry, I felt flayed open, every weakness exposed and examined. When we finally rose from the table, Adrian caught my arm. Drawing room, he murmured. We need to present a united front. Can you manage another hour? I thought about refusing, about fleeing to my room in this entire charade, but I'd agreed to this, and I'd survived worse than the judgment of society women. I can manage, I said. The drawing room was somehow worse than dinner. The women arranged themselves like a court, with the dowager presiding and Adrian and I on display. Someone suggested cards. Someone else proposed music. Finally, Lady Beatrice smiled her blade-sharp smile and said, "Why don't we play a game? Something to help us all become better acquainted." "What sort of game?" Catherine asked, wariness creeping into her voice. "Truth or consequences? We each ask a question, and the answer must be completely honest, or face a consequence." Beatrice's gaze fixed on me. "Unless Miss Hartley is afraid of a little honesty?" "Beatrice," Adrian started, but I cut him off. "I'm not afraid." The lie came easily. I was terrified, but I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing it. "Wonderful." Beatrice's smile widened. "Then I'll begin. Miss Hartley, do you love Adrian, or do you love what he can give you?" The room held its breath. 7 women, 1 dowager, and Adrian all waiting to see if I would tell the truth or damn myself with a lie. I looked at Adrian, at the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw had tightened. We'd agreed to pretend, but we'd never discussed how far that pretense should go. I began, and then stopped, because sitting there, in that drawing room full of enemies, with diamonds around my throat and lies on my tongue, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't sure anymore where the pretense ended and the truth began. "I love that he makes me feel seen," I said slowly, carefully. In a world that tried very hard to make me invisible, Adrian looked at me and saw someone worth knowing, someone worth protecting, someone worth, I faltered, then pushed forward, someone worth choosing. "So yes, Lady Beatrice, I love him, and if that makes me a fortune hunter in your eyes, then I suppose I'll have to live with your judgment." Silence, absolute and complete. Then Eleanor started crying, actual tears streaming down her face. "That's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," she sobbed. "It's also conveniently vague," Sarah Preston observed. "Loving what someone does for you isn't the same as loving the person." But Adrian was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read, something intense and complicated that made my heart hammer against my ribs. "My turn," the dowager said, her voice cutting through the moment like scissors through silk. "Adrian, be honest with your mother, if no one else. Is this engagement real, or is it some scheme to avoid the matches I've arranged?" The trap was perfect. Admit the scheme, and we'd both be humiliated. Lie, and he'd be betraying me along with his mother. Adrian stood, and something in his posture made everyone else fall silent. When I asked Charlotte to marry me, I was desperate. I won't lie about that. I wanted escape from expectations, from pressure, from the feeling that my life belonged to everyone except myself. My heart sank. He was going to confess. He was going to. But somewhere between asking and now, something changed. His eyes found mine. Charlotte stands in this room surrounded by women who want to destroy her, wearing armor I gave her, defending herself with nothing but honesty and courage. And I realize that what began as convenience might become something far more dangerous. Dangerous how? The Dowager demanded. Dangerous because I might actually fall in love with her. Adrian's voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room, and that was never part of the plan. The words hung in the air like a confession, like a promise, like a threat. Lady Beatrice stood abruptly. I have a headache. I'm retiring. One by one, the others made excuses and fled, until only Catherine remained. She looked between Adrian and me, something sad and knowing in her expression. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I hope it becomes real. You both deserve something genuine in all this pretense. Then she too was gone. The Dowager rose last, her expression unreadable. Dawn, Charlotte, don't be late. And then Adrian and I were alone in a room that suddenly felt too small, with words between us that couldn't be unsaid. Did you mean that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. He looked as shaken as I felt, but I'm starting to think that might be the most honest thing I've said in years. I should have been relieved. The performance had worked, we'd convinced them, maybe even convinced ourselves. So why did I feel like I was standing on the edge of something that would either save me or destroy me completely? We should rest, Adrian said finally. Tomorrow will be difficult. Adrian, don't. His voice was rough. Don't ask me questions I can't answer. Not tonight. Not when I'm not sure I know the truth anymore. I nodded, though my chest felt tight with words I couldn't speak. As I walked back to my room, diamonds cold against my throat and silk rustling around my legs, I tried to remember that this was temporary. That at summer's end, I'd leave with my money and my freedom, and Adrian would return to his careful, controlled life. But the memory of his words I might actually fall in love with her echoed through my mind like a warning I didn't know how to heed. In the hallway, I passed a mirror and caught my reflection. The woman looking back at me wore a duchess's clothes and a duchess's jewels, but her eyes looked like someone who'd just realized she was in far deeper than she'd ever intended to go. Dawn came too quickly and far too cold. I stood in the entrance hall at 5:30 in the morning, dressed in a simple day gown that the maid had laid out practical wool and slate gray that made me look like a governess. The Dowager appeared precisely at 6 o'clock, dressed for battle in midnight blue, her expression promising no mercy. Punctual, she observed, as if she'd expected me to fail even this simple test. How refreshing. Come along then. We have 12 tenant families to visit, a committee meeting at the village hall, and the charity hospital to inspect before lunch. I trust you have sturdy shoes. I did. The same worn boots I'd arrived in, hidden beneath my borrowed skirts. The carriage ride was silent, the Dowager staring out the window as if I didn't exist. When we reached the first tenant cottage, a small but tidy dwelling where a family of 6 somehow lived, she finally spoke. Mrs. Whitmore, this is Miss Hartley, my son's, intended. She'll be observing today. The pause before intended carried volumes of doubt. Mrs. Whitmore, a woman with work-roughened hands and kind eyes, curtsied. Welcome, miss. Would you care for tea? What followed was 4 hours of the most exhausting social performance of my life. The Dowager moved through her rounds with ruthless efficiency, discussing crop yields with farmers, settling disputes between neighbors, evaluating which families needed additional support and which were managing well enough. She knew every name, every child, every circumstance, and she watched me constantly, waiting for me to fail. At the third cottage, a young mother held a feverish baby who wouldn't stop crying. The Dowager examined the child with clinical precision, pronounced it a mild chill, and prescribed rest and broth. As we left, I heard the mother whisper, "Thank God for her grace. Without her, we'd have lost little Thomas last winter." You do this every week? I asked as we climbed back into the carriage. Every week for 32 years, the Dowager's voice was matter of fact. Being a duchess isn't about wearing diamonds at dinner parties, Miss Hartley. It's about knowing when Mrs. Whitmore's eldest son has finally saved enough to open his shop, and when the blacksmith's wife needs help she's too proud to ask for. and which families are one bad harvest away from destitution. It's about being responsible for lives that depend on you. I absorbed this, seeing her clearly for the first time, not as an enemy, but as a woman who'd devoted her entire adult life to caring for people who couldn't care for themselves. "You think I can't do this?" I said quietly. "I think you've never had to." She met my eyes directly. "And I think my son, in his desperation to escape his responsibilities, has made you a promise he has no intention of keeping." "What do you mean?" "I mean that Adrian will not marry you." Her voice was certain, almost gentle in its cruelty. "He'll realize by summer's end that this was a mistake, that you're unsuited to this life, and he'll find some way to extricate himself while protecting your reputation. You'll leave with your settlement, and he'll return to the business of finding an appropriate duchess, someone like Catherine Blackwood, who was raised for this role." The words landed like blows, each one finding a mark because they echoed my own fears. "You don't know your son as well as you think," I said, though my voice shook. "Don't I?" The dowager's smile was sad. "I know he's been planning this for months. I know he asked the Duke of Ashford about broken engagements and how to end them without scandal. I know," she paused. "I know my son is a good man who makes terrible choices when he feels trapped." My chest felt hollow. "He asked about ending engagements? When?" "2 months ago, before I'd even sent the invitations to the other ladies." She watched my face carefully. "I'm sorry, Miss Hartley, truly. You seem like a decent woman in an impossible situation. But you're not the solution to Adrian's problems. You're just another problem he'll eventually need to solve." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Committee meetings where I sat silent and useless. The charity hospital where the dowager moved through wards with practiced compassion while I stood awkwardly in corners. By the time we returned to Thornbridge Manor, I felt hollowed out, scraped clean of whatever foolish hope I'd been harboring. Adrian was waiting in the entrance hall, his expression anxious. "How did—" "She did adequately," the dowager interrupted. "Though adequacy isn't quite sufficient for a duchess, is it? Excuse me, I have correspondence to attend to." She swept away, leaving Adrian and me alone. "Charlotte, what happened?" He reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "Did you ask the Duke of Ashford about ending engagements?" My voice sounded distant, disconnected. 2 months ago, before any of this began? Adrian went still. "Who told you that? Is it true?" "Yes, but—" "So this was always the plan." I felt strangely calm, as if I were watching this conversation happen to someone else. "Fake engagement, get through the summer, end it cleanly. You were researching the exit strategy before you'd even found your temporary fiancé." "Charlotte, listen to me." "I am listening. For the first time, I think I'm actually hearing you clearly." I met his eyes. "Your mother was right. I'm not the solution to your problems. I'm just another complication you'll need to manage until summer ends." "That's not—" He stopped, ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "That's not what this is anymore, isn't it?" "No." His voice was raw. "When I asked Ashford about ending engagements, I was planning exactly what you think, a convenient arrangement with a clean ending. But then I met you. And you stood in that garden looking at me like I was a person instead of a title. And you faced down 7 hostile women and my mother without flinching. And you," he faltered, "you made me feel something I haven't felt in years. Hope, maybe, or possibility. The sense that my life could be something other than obligation and performance." "Pretty words," I said, though my throat was tight. "But words don't change reality. I'll never be what your mother is. I don't know how to manage an estate or chair committees or remember every tenant's name. I'm a widow with debts and no connections and no training for any of this. I don't want you to be my mother." Adrian stepped closer, and this time when he reached for my hands, I let him take them. "I want you to be yourself. The woman who told Lady Beatrice that she'd live with judgment rather than deny what she felt. The woman who survived loss and betrayal and society's cruelty with her dignity intact. That woman is worth more than all the proper training in the world." "But it's not real." The words escaped as a whisper. "This engagement, these feelings, they're built on a lie, Adrian, and I don't know how to tell anymore what's performance and what's truth." "Then let me tell you a truth." His hands tightened on mine. When I said last night that I might be falling in love with you, I was terrified because falling in love wasn't part of the plan. It complicated everything. But standing here now, watching you doubt yourself, because my mother spent all day trying to convince you you're not enough. Charlotte, the only lie is the one that says this isn't real. My breath caught. What are you saying? I'm saying I don't want a fake engagement that ends in August. I'm saying that somewhere between asking you to pretend and now, I stopped pretending. I'm saying, he paused, something vulnerable and desperate in his expression. I'm saying that if you'll have me, I'd like this to be real, all of it, not an arrangement with an expiration date, but an actual marriage to you, debts and all, inadequacies and all, truth and all. The world seemed to tilt. You can't mean that. I've never meant anything more. He released one of my hands to touch my face, his fingers gentle against my cheek. I know this is fast. I know it's complicated. I know my mother will fight us, and society will judge us, and nothing about this will be easy. But Charlotte, I've spent my entire life doing what's easy, what's expected, what's proper, and I've been miserable. You make me want to be brave enough to choose something just because it makes me happy, even if it's terrifying, even if it's impossible. I should have said no, should have protected myself from this kind of vulnerability. But standing there with Adrian's hand on my face and his impossible proposal hanging in the air between us, I realized something. I'd stopped pretending too. I'm terrified, I whispered. Good. His smile was shaky but real. So am I. We'll be terrified together. Your mother will never accept me. My mother will learn to, or she won't, but that's her choice, not mine. His thumb brushed away a tear I hadn't realized had fallen. Charlotte, will you marry me? Really marry me? Not for convenience or money or escape, but because somewhere in this mess of lies and desperation, we found something true? I thought about Thomas, about the lies he'd told and the debts he'd left, about the months of grief and shame and loneliness, about standing in this entrance hall just days ago, a ghost at my own life, invisible and forgotten. And then I thought about Adrian looking at me like I mattered, about facing down hostile women with his support, about the way his confession last night had felt both terrifying and inevitable. Yes, I said, and watched his expression transform into something incandescent. Yes, I'll marry you. Really marry you, even though it's insane and complicated and probably doomed. Definitely doomed, he agreed, and then he was kissing me. Not the careful, performed kiss of our engagement announcement, but something real and desperate and absolutely improper for an entrance hall where servants might see. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Adrian rested his forehead against mine. We should probably tell my mother. She's going to be furious. Absolutely livid, he grinned. Worth it, though. We found the dowager in her sitting room, along with all 7 candidates for Duchess. They'd apparently been summoned for some kind of meeting, and they all looked up as Adrian and I entered, our faces still flushed, our hands clasped together. Mother, Adrian said. Ladies, I have an announcement. Charlotte and I have decided to move the wedding forward. We'll marry in 3 weeks rather than waiting until autumn. The room erupted. Lady Beatrice looked apoplectic. Eleanor burst into tears, happy ones this time. Sarah Preston looked like she was recalculating every assumption she'd ever made. And Catherine Blackwood smiled, genuine and warm. But it was the dowager's expression that held my attention. She looked between Adrian and me, taking in our joined hands, our matching determination, the way we stood together rather than apart. I see, she said finally. And you're certain, both of you? This isn't some extension of your charade? I've never been more certain of anything, Adrian said. The dowager's gaze shifted to me. Miss Hartley? I thought about lying, about giving her the answer she wanted to hear. But Adrian and I had started this with a lie. We didn't need another one. I'm terrified, I admitted. I don't know how to be a duchess. I'll probably fail at half the things you do effortlessly. But I love your son, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of him in this position, even if I never quite succeed. Something in the dowager's expression shifted. Not acceptance exactly, but perhaps the beginning of respect. Well, she said, at least you're honest. That's more than I can say for most of the women in this room. Her gaze swept across the 7 candidates. Ladies, I believe our house party has come to an end. I'll arrange for carriages tomorrow morning. As the women filed out, some angry, some relieved, Catherine pausing to squeeze my hand in congratulation, the dowager turned back to us. 3 weeks isn't enough time to plan a proper wedding. Then we'll have an improper one, Adrian said. The dowager's mouth twitched. It might have been a smile. You're going to be a trial, aren't you? Both of you. Undoubtedly, I agreed. Good. She stood, gathering her correspondence. I was getting bored with proper. Perhaps some chaos will do this house good. She paused at the door. Welcome to the family, Charlotte. Try not to let us destroy you. After she left, Adrian pulled me close, and we stood there in the fading afternoon light, 2 people who'd started as strangers, become temporary allies, and somehow transformed into something real. Do you think we're making a terrible mistake? I asked. Absolutely. Adrian's arms tightened around me. But it's our mistake, and I'd rather make it with you than succeed at someone else's plan for my life. 3 weeks later, I married the Duke of Thornbridge in a small ceremony attended by bemused tenants, skeptical society members, and a dowager who still looked like she couldn't quite believe what was happening. As Adrian slipped a ring onto my finger, not his grandmother's diamonds, but something new that was entirely ours, I thought about the woman I'd been at my cousin's wedding, invisible, grieving, lost, and I looked at the woman I'd become, seen, chosen, found. The pretending had ended, the truth had begun. And if you've stayed with me through this whole impossible story, if you've believed in second chances and unexpected love and the courage it takes to stop pretending and start living, then please, subscribe to Velvet and Vintage Tales. Hit that like button if this story touched your heart. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss another tale of love across time, where every ending is really just a beginning in disguise. Because sometimes the best love stories are the ones that start with a lie and end with the truest thing you've ever known. Sometimes all you need is a wedding you don't want to attend, a duke desperate enough to ask an impossible question, and the courage to turn a pretend engagement into a real forever. Thank you for letting me share my story. Until the next tale unfolds in the ballrooms and manor houses of England's romantic past, remember that love is always worth the risk, even when it terrifies you, especially when it terrifies you.